She walked into the grand hall, feeling completely out of place. The walls shimmered with golden light, reflecting the crystal chandeliers that hung high above the polished floors. Every surface gleamed, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes and fresh flowers. She had never been in a place like this before. She worked at the event as part of the serving staff, carrying trays of drinks and plates with careful precision, making sure she did not spill anything or draw attention to herself. She had learned long ago how to move silently, how to smile politely even when her hands were shaking, and how to blend into the background. Tonight, like many nights before, she was invisible, and that suited her just fine. She adjusted the tray in her hands, weaving carefully between groups of guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. They laughed in low, confident tones, talking about business deals and luxury vacations, their lives seemingly far removed from anything she knew. She kept her eyes low, her steps quiet, trying not to make a sound. She had come here not for herself, not to be noticed, but to do a job and leave without incident. That was always the plan. But then something happened that she had not expected. The main pianist, who was supposed to play for the evening, never arrived. No one knew exactly why. Some whispered that there had been a traffic problem. Others speculated that the musician had simply canceled at the last minute. Regardless of the reason, the host's irritation was clear. He paced in front of the grand piano, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the floor, muttering under his breath. The guests began to murmur among themselves, unsure what would happen next. Some looked around impatiently, others sighed, expecting the entertainment for the evening to be ruined. Her heart began to race as she saw the host's gaze sweep the room. It landed on her. She froze for a moment, unsure if she had imagined it. But then she saw him nod slightly toward the piano. She knew instantly what he meant. He wanted her to play. "No, I can't," she said quietly to herself. Her voice barely carried over the low hum of conversation. She had played the piano before, of course. She had been practicing since she was a child. Music had been her refuge, her escape, the one thing that made sense in a world that often felt cold and unfair. But she had never performed in front of people like this. She had never been forced into a spotlight surrounded by strangers who would judge her in an instant. She took a careful step toward the piano, trying to look busy, as though she were simply checking the area or arranging something on a table nearby. But the host was persistent. He approached her quickly, his face stern. "Come on," he said firmly. "You'll do fine. Just sit there and play. It won't be hard." She shook her head, trying to protest, but the words felt weak and insignificant. The host's presence was intimidating, and his authority in the room left little room for refusal. Guests had begun to notice the interaction, their eyes flicking toward her with curiosity. Some smiled politely, assuming this would be amusing. Others whispered among themselves, clearly expecting a disaster. She could feel their judgment before she even touched the keys. Her legs moved almost without her thinking. Carrying her toward the piano, she kept her back straight and her head down, trying to remain calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Every step felt heavy, as if the floor itself were trying to slow her down. She reached the bench and hesitated. The polished wood of the piano gleamed under the lights. Its surface was smooth and cold to the touch, and the keys shone, waiting. She rested her hands lightly on the edges. Feeling the tension in her own body rise, she took a deep breath and tried to remember the countless hours she had spent practicing in her small apartment. She had learned to play quietly, in corners where no one could hear her. She had poured herself into every note, every chord, every simple melody she had ever learned. Music was her companion, her confidant. But now, in this grand room filled with people who expected her to fail, it felt like a completely different language. Guests began to glance in her direction, some with curiosity, others with amusement. A few leaned against tables, talking in low voices, clearly expecting something entertaining to happen. She could hear their whispers. "She's just a waitress. How good can she be? Maybe this will be funny. I wonder if she's ever played in front of people like us before." Each whisper felt like a small weight pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to disappear, to run back into the kitchen and hide among the shadows. But but something inside her refused to let her turn away. She had worked too hard to ignore who she was. She had spent years learning, struggling, practicing when no one believed in her, when no one cared. She could do this. She had to. She sat down on the piano bench, adjusting herself carefully. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of expectation pressing down. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the noise and focus on the music inside her head. She thought about the melodies she had played countless times alone, the songs that had comforted her when life was difficult. She thought about the joy of hearing a note resonate perfectly under her fingers, the sense of control, of beauty, of expression. The room was silent for a moment, the chatter fading as if the music waiting in her hands had already begun to command attention. She opened her eyes and looked at the keys. They were the same keys she had known for years, the same keys that had felt like home in her apartment late at night. Now, in this strange and intimidating setting, they felt different. They felt like a bridge between who she was and who everyone else expected her to be. She placed her hands lightly on the keys and pressed the first note. It sounded soft, almost shy, but it was precise. She felt a small surge of confidence as the sound filled the room. It was not loud or flashy, but it carried a presence that made people stop and listen. She took a deep breath and continued, letting her fingers move naturally over the keys, finding the melody in her mind and letting it flow. At first, the room remained skeptical. Guests exchanged glances, still unsure if this would be a performance worth noting. But as the music continued, she began to notice subtle changes. Conversations slowed. Smiles faded into thoughtful expressions. Even the host, who had seemed so impatient just moments ago, leaned slightly forward, watching her with new interest. She allowed herself to sink into the music, letting the nervousness fade. Each note became a statement, each chord a declaration of her presence. She could feel the tension in the room melting as the music took over. The guests who had whispered and judged were now listening, absorbed in something they had not expected. She could see their eyes following her hands, noticing the skill, the control, subtle emotion in every movement. The music began to flow more freely, and with it, so did her confidence. She had always known this ability was inside her, even if no one else had. Now, in this grand hall filled with strangers who thought they knew her limits, she was proving something. Not to them, not to the host, but to herself. She could rise above their expectations, above the assumptions, above the casual judgments. She could transform this moment into something meaningful. As she played, she felt a sense of connection that was deeper than any applause or recognition. It was a connection to her own journey, to the years of dedication and quiet determination that had brought her here. She remembered the nights of solitude, the early mornings, the sacrifices she had made to continue learning and improving. All of that had led to this moment, a moment where her talent could no longer be ignored or hidden. She played with a mixture of precision and emotion, letting the music speak for her. She did not need words. She did not need approval. Each note carried a piece of her story, a piece of her heart, a piece of the life she had lived quietly and persistently. And as the room began to truly listen, she realized something important. This was her moment, her stage. She could own it without fear or hesitation. By the time she finished the first piece, the room was quiet, but the silence was not awkward. It was full of attention, curiosity, and surprise. She could feel the shift in energy, the way people were now seeing her differently, even if they did not yet understand the depth of her skill. She allowed herself a small breath of relief, knowing that she had survived the first challenge and, more importantly, that she had done so with integrity and heart. She remained seated at the piano, ready to continue, knowing that the evening was far from over, but also knowing that she had taken the first step in revealing a side of herself that few had ever seen. The grand hall, once intimidating and alien, was beginning to feel like a space where her music could matter, where her voice, though unspoken, could be heard. And in that quiet, soft moment, she realized that being forced into the spotlight was not a curse. It was an opportunity to show the world and herself the power and beauty of her talent. She was no longer just a server blending into the background. She was a musician, a storyteller, a person who had something valuable to offer. And tonight, whether the guests understood it or not, her music would speak louder than any words ever could. The first notes had filled the room, and a strange quiet had settled over the crowd. Conversations that had been lively just moments before had slowed to murmurs and then faded entirely. She could feel eyes on her, and with each glance she became more aware of the subtle judgments hidden behind polite smiles. Some people looked amused, some skeptical, and some genuinely curious. But she didn't let that stop her. She had learned long ago that music, not words, could carry the truth of who she was. She began her second piece carefully, letting her fingers glide over the keys with a gentle confidence. The piece was one she had composed herself, a melody born from years of practice in her small apartment, late at night when the world was asleep. It was personal, full of the struggles she had faced, the quiet victories, and the moments when she had felt completely alone. As the notes filled the hall, she felt herself becoming part of the music, and the music becoming part of her. The guests, who had been expecting a simple performance at best, began to shift in their seats. Some leaned slightly forward, their eyes widening as they realized the depth of her talent. Others exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that this was not what they had anticipated. A few people who had been scrolling on their phones looked up, startled, as though the sound itself had caught them by surprise. She could feel the tension in her own body ease slightly as she continued. The first piece had been about finding her footing in a strange place, but this one was different. This one was about expression, about letting the world hear the parts of her that had been hidden. Every note was intentional, every pause deliberate. She let herself feel the emotions she had been holding inside frustration. Hope-longing Anne translated them into music. The room was still, but the silence was not empty. It was alive with attention, alive with the sense that something rare and genuine was happening. Even the host, who had seemed so impatient and controlling earlier, was now watching her with a different expression. His arms were crossed, and his brow was furrowed. But there was a shift in his posture, recognition that this was more than just background music. She noticed small details around the room she had not seen before. The way a glass reflected the light of the chandeliers. The subtle way someone's fingers tapped against a table in time with the rhythm. The quiet fascination in people's eyes as they followed the movement of her hands. These observations grounded her, reminded her that the music was not just about her own feelings, but about connecting with others. Even in a room filled with strangers, for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to think beyond her own nerves and her own doubts. She began to feel a sense of control, a sense that she could shape this moment through her skill and her emotion. Music had always been her escape, but now it was also her voice, her way of asserting herself in a world that had often overlooked her. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her body move naturally with the rhythm. She had always been taught that playing the piano was not just about hitting the right keys, but about using the whole body, letting emotion guide movement. She remembered her teacher's words from years ago about how music should breathe, how it should tell a story without a single word being spoken. She could feel that story now, flowing through her hands and into the room. The audience responded in subtle ways. A couple of people who had been talking quietly now stopped and turned fully toward her. Someone whispered to their companion, but the words were carried softly and with admiration, not mockery. She caught a few smiles, brief but genuine, as people began to realize that this was not a simple performance. This was an expression of something rare, something crafted with skill and heart. Her confidence grew with each passing measure. She allowed herself to play more freely, experimenting with the dynamics and tempo, letting crescendos rise and fall naturally. She could hear the room reacting without needing to look. A slight gasp here, a quiet sigh there, and the occasional soft murmur of approval. The atmosphere had changed completely from when she first sat down. What had begun as an awkward interruption for the guests had become a moment of attention and awe. She could feel the host's eyes on her again, this time with a different intensity. He had been expecting something easy, something quickly forgotten. Instead, he was witnessing the unveiling of a hidden talent, a mastery that had been underestimated simply because of her role in the event. She sensed his surprise, and though it did not matter to her what he thought, it reminded her of the judgment she had faced, her entire life and how she had persevered despite it. The music became a conversation, not just between her and the keys, but between her and everyone in the room. She could sense emotions shifting, tensions softening, and minds opening. Guests who had been skeptical were now engaged, their faces reflecting surprise, curiosity, and even admiration. Some were silent, lost in thought, caught by the authenticity and depth of what they were hearing. Others nodded along with the rhythm, unable to hide their appreciation. She allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far she had come. This room, with all its wealth and status, had once felt intimidating and impossible. She had imagined herself performing only in quiet rooms, in spaces where no one would judge her. Yet here she was, surrounded by people who had underestimated her, proving to herself that her talent was not defined by anyone else's expectations. Her fingers moved more confidently now, flowing across the keys with a natural grace. The music began to tell a story, one that she had carried with her for years. It was a story of persistence, of struggle, of quiet victories, and small joys. She remembered the nights when she had practiced alone, when she had felt invisible and unheard. Now, in this luxurious hall, she was finally being heard, not through words, but through the language she knew best. Every chord, every note was deliberate. She had learned to control her emotions through music, to let the keys reflect her inner world. As the melody progressed, she could feel the audience leaning in, some unconsciously, drawn by the sincerity of the performance. She noticed small gestures, a hand resting on a glass that was no longer tapping, eyes fixed on the piano, subtle nods of acknowledgement. These small signs of recognition were more powerful than any words could have been. She allowed herself to breathe with the music, letting each note guide her movements and each pause create space for reflection. She could feel her own nervousness melting away, replaced by a quiet certainty that she was capable of more than anyone had imagined. The music became a mirror of her own journey, reflecting the determination, the sacrifices, the quiet pride that had carried her to this moment. The guests, too, were changing. The initial amusement and doubt had completely disappeared. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in the experience, listening and feeling the emotions embedded in every note. She noticed some exchanging whispered comments, not mocking, but in awe, trying to put into words what the music was conveying. Others simply watched in silence, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Even the staff around her, who had been moving quietly through the room, paused briefly to listen. The kitchen staff, who had been busy with drinks and food now, stopped at the edges of the hall, caught by the unexpected depth of her performance. She realized then that her music was reaching far beyond her own perception, touching people who had not expected to feel anything significant at all. As she continued, she felt a sense of liberation. She was no longer a server in the background, no longer someone overlooked or underestimated. For the first time that evening, she was fully herself, using her talent to communicate in a way that transcended social barriers, expectations, and assumptions. Each note was a declaration of her existence, her skill, and her worth. The piece began to build toward its climax, and with it, her energy surged. Her fingers moved quickly but precisely, the melody rising and falling like waves, each note carrying intention and feeling. She felt the room responding instinctively. A quiet intake of breath here, subtle shift in posture there, and the undeniable sense that everyone was fully attentive. The power of the music was undeniable, and she could feel it resonating through the polished floors and high ceilings, filling every corner of the hall. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this room had always been meant for her music, that the chandeliers, the golden walls, and the attentive audience were simply a reflection of her own inner world. The fear that had gripped her when she first approached the piano was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence and a deep connection to the sound she was creating. The final notes lingered in the air, soft and deliberate, as if waiting for the audience to catch their breath and absorb what they had just heard. She lifted her hands from the keys and allowed a brief silence to settle over the hall. The impact of the performance was already visible. People were leaning back in their chairs, eyes wide, expressions reflective. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others simply stared, unable to speak, in that moment.
Oh.
She realized that she had not just played a piece of music. She had shifted the energy of the room, challenged assumptions, and revealed a part of herself that had long been hidden. The quiet that followed was not awkward or tense. It was filled with recognition, appreciation, and a subtle awe that spoke louder than any words ever could. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the experience settle on her shoulders. She knew that the night was far from over, that there would be more eyes on her, more expectations to meet. But for now, she allowed herself to feel the small, a quiet victory of having shown her skill, her dedication, and her heart. She had faced judgment, nerves, and doubt. And she had emerged not just unscathed, but stronger, more confident, and more certain of her own worth. And as she sat there, the echoes of the music still lingering in the hall, she realized that this night would be remembered not because of the luxury around her, not because of the wealth and status of the guests, but because she had dared to be herself, to let her talent speak, and to transform an unexpected challenge into a moment of truth and beauty. She did not stand up after finishing the last piece. She stayed seated for a moment, her hands resting softly in her lap, her breathing slow but deep. The silence in the room felt heavier than before, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of silence that meant people were thinking, feeling, trying to understand what they had just heard. No one rushed to clap. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room needed a few seconds to catch up with the music. She looked down at the keys, noticing how still her fingers were now. Just moments earlier, they had been moving freely, telling a story without words. Now they were quiet, and she felt strangely exposed again. The confidence she had gained while playing did not disappear, but it softened, turning into awareness. She could sense that something had changed, not just inside her, but in the room itself. Slowly, a few claps began. One pair of hands, then another. The sound was hesitant at first, almost unsure, as if people were checking whether it was appropriate to react. Then the applause grew. It spread across the room, filling the space between the chandeliers and the polished floor. Some people clapped politely. Others clapped with genuine enthusiasm. A few even stood, surprising themselves as much as anyone else. She stood up carefully, unsure of what to do next. She had never imagined herself in a moment like this. Applause had always been something she heard in her mind, not something directed at her. She gave a small nod, more out of habit than confidence, and stepped slightly away from the piano. The host approached her, slower than before, his expression no longer impatient. There was a stiffness in his posture, as if he was trying to maintain control of the situation, but his eyes told a different story. He looked surprised, almost unsettled. "That was unexpected," he said, clearing his throat. She nodded again, unsure how to respond. Words felt unnecessary. Everything she wanted to say had already been said through the music. The guests began to talk again. But the tone was different now. The quiet laughter and casual chatter were replaced with focused conversation. People leaned toward each other, whispering observations and questions. Some glanced at her openly now, not with judgment, but with curiosity and respect. A woman near the front table whispered to her companion, her voice filled with disbelief. "She's not just playing. She understands the music." Another guest shook his head slowly. "That wasn't something you just learn. That takes years." She could hear fragments of these conversations as she stepped back slightly, returning toward the edge of the room. The staff resumed their movements, but even they seemed different now. A few offered her quick, supportive looks as they passed by. It was subtle, but it mattered. She expected the moment to pass, for the guests to return fully to their drinks and conversations, for her to fade back into the background where she was used to being, but that did not happen. Instead, the host turned back toward her. "Can you play again?" he asked, this time without the demanding tone. "Something longer." She hesitated. This was no longer a forced moment. This was a choice. Her heart beat faster, but not from fear alone. There was excitement now, mixed with responsibility. She nodded slowly and returned to the piano. As she sat down again, she felt different. Not braver, not bolder, but more honest. She adjusted the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The room quieted almost immediately, as if everyone understood that something important was about to continue. She chose a piece that required patience. It began softly, with simple notes, almost fragile. The melody unfolded slowly, like a story being told one memory at a time. She let each note breathe, allowing the silence between sounds to carry meaning. The guests listened more closely now. No one laughed. No one checked their phone. Even those who did not fully understand music could feel the intention behind every movement. It was no longer about being impressed. It was about being moved. As she played, memories returned to her. Not distractions, but sources of strength. She remembered the first piano she had ever touched, old and slightly out of tune. She remembered learning to play quietly so she would not disturb anyone. She remembered the frustration of wanting more, of knowing she could do more, but not having the space or support to prove it. Those memories shaped the music. They gave it depth and honesty. She did not try to impress anyone with speed or volume. She played with control, with restraint, with emotion that felt real. She noticed people leaning closer again. One man rested his elbows on the table, completely absorbed. A woman pressed her lips together, her eyes fixed on the keys. Someone near the back wiped at their eyes quickly, as if embarrassed by their own reaction. The host stood still now, no longer pacing. His arms were no longer crossed. His attention was fully on her. The piece grew stronger as it continued. The melody rose, not loudly, but confidently. Her fingers moved with ease, guided by years of quiet dedication. She did not rush. She let the music unfold naturally, trusting herself fully. For the first time in her life, she felt seen without being judged. When the final notes faded, the response was immediate. Applause filled the room again, louder this time, more certain. Several guests stood without hesitation. The sound echoed against the walls, wrapping around her like warmth. She stood slowly, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. She did not smile widely. Instead, her expression remained calm, grounded. This moment did not feel like a performance anymore. It felt like truth. As the applause faded, people began approaching her. Not all at once, but one by one. Some offered quiet compliments. Others asked simple questions about where she had learned to play. A few admitted openly that they had underestimated her. One older guest spoke gently. "You don't just play notes. You tell stories." She thanked them softly, still adjusting to the attention. Each interaction felt unreal, but sincere. Then something unexpected happened. A man who had been sitting quietly near the back stepped forward. He did not speak loudly. He did not push through the crowd. He waited patiently until she noticed him. "I've attended many events like this," he said calmly. "I've heard many musicians. What you did tonight was rare." She listened carefully, unsure where the conversation would lead. "You were forced into this," he continued. "And still, you played with honesty. That matters." She nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. No one had ever said that to her before. The host cleared his throat again, stepping closer. "I owe you an apology," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "I assumed too much." She met his eyes briefly and nodded. She did not need more than that. As the night continued, the atmosphere remained changed. The music she had played stayed with the guests. Conversations circled back to it again and again. Even when the piano was silent, her presence was not. She returned briefly to her duties, but things were different now. People noticed her. They spoke to her kindly. Some asked if she would play again before the night ended. She realized then that the biggest change was not how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She was no longer hiding her talent. She was no longer shrinking to fit expectations. She had not planned for this night to change anything. She had only wanted to get through it quietly. But now she understood something important. Sometimes, being pushed into the spotlight reveals what was always there. And as she looked back at the piano across the room, She knew this story was far from over. The music had stopped, but the room still seemed alive with echoes of the notes that had just been played. People were talking again, but their voices were softer, more thoughtful. There was a sense of reflection in the air, as if everyone present was trying to understand the experience they had just witnessed. The initial judgment and casual amusement had vanished, replaced by curiosity and awe. She stepped back from the piano, her hands still tingling from the final notes. The sensation was familiar, yet different this time. She had played countless hours alone, practiced melodies that only she had ever heard. But now, her music had been felt by others. It had touched people she had never met and perhaps never would. That realization was both humbling and powerful. The host walked over slowly. His earlier impatience was gone. Instead, he studied her with a new respect, though his pride still kept him from admitting it fully. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "I didn't expect that." She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Words were not necessary. The music had said more than any apology or compliment could. Guests began approaching her, some with timid admiration, others with genuine awe. One woman spoke first, her voice soft but insistent. "I've never heard anything like that. You don't just play, you communicate. You tell a story that reaches people." She smiled slightly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. No one had ever described her playing like that before. She had spent so many years hiding her talent, practicing in silence, worrying that her music might never matter outside the walls of her small apartment. Now she realized it had mattered in ways she could not have imagined. Another guest approached. It's a man who had seemed critical at the start of the evening. His posture was stiff, but his voice carried genuine curiosity. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. "It must take decades to reach this level." "Most of my life," she replied simply. There was no need for exaggeration. Her years of dedication were obvious in every note she had played. As the conversations continued, she noticed that the audience's perception of her had shifted completely. The whispers of doubt were gone. People no longer questioned her ability or her place at the event. Instead, they were discussing the music itself, the emotion behind it, the control and depth she had shown. Even those who had laughed quietly before now looked at her with a mix of respect and wonder. She felt a quiet pride, not in the recognition she was receiving, but in the fact that she had remained true to herself. She had played not to impress, but to express. She had allowed the music to carry her story, and it had succeeded in reaching the hearts of others. That realization filled her with a calm confidence she had never experienced before. The host, observing the interactions, finally spoke again. "You have something rare," he admitted, though carefully, as if testing the weight of his own words. "I don't know if I've ever seen someone take a simple request and turn it into that." She nodded slightly. She did not need more praise. The night had already given her what she needed most: acknowledgement of her true ability and the opportunity to share it honestly. A few guests, emboldened by the experience, began asking her about her background. They wanted to know where she had studied, who had taught her, how she had developed such skill. Each question was carefully phrased, reflecting admiration rather than simple curiosity. She answered modestly, not because she lacked pride, but because she had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. As the night progressed, she found herself surrounded by people who were genuinely interested in her talent, rather than the superficial aspects of the event. They asked thoughtful questions, listened intently to her explanations, and even requested that she play again. Each request felt less like an obligation and more like an opportunity to connect. To continue sharing a piece of herself through music, she returned to the piano, seating herself with a calm grace. The room had grown quieter once more, as if anticipating something extraordinary. She let her fingers rest lightly on the keys, feeling the familiar tension and excitement build inside her. She began to play, this time choosing a piece that was deeply personal, one she had composed herself. The melody was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but as she continued, it grew in confidence, carrying layers of emotion she had long held inside. The guests were silent again, but this silence was different from the first. There was no doubt, no skepticism. only focus, attention, and receptivity. People leaned forward slightly in their seats, unconsciously drawn to the music and the story it conveyed. The room, once filled with casual chatter and polite amusement, had become a space of shared experience, united by sound and emotion. She let the music flow naturally, allowing herself to feel everything she had suppressed for years. Each note reflected a memory, a struggle, a victory, or a moment of quiet perseverance. She had spent so long learning to hide her feelings, to play in private without judgment or expectation. Now, the world was listening, and her vulnerability was met not with ridicule, but with understanding. For the first time, she realized that her music had the power to reach people in a way that words could not. People did not need to know her story to feel it. The melodies carried her experiences, her emotions, and her resilience directly into their hearts. She could see subtle reactions in the room. A person's hand resting lightly on the table. A nod, a quiet sigh, a distant look in someone's eyes. Each small gesture confirmed what she had suspected all along: her music mattered. As the piece progressed, her confidence grew. She no longer played tentatively, no longer doubted her ability to command attention or convey emotion. Her hands moved fluidly, almost instinctively, guided by the rhythm of her heart and the depth of her experience. She felt connected to the piano in a way that transcended technique or training. It was as if the music itself was a living extension of her thoughts and feelings, translating the unspoken into a language that everyone could understand. The audience was captivated. They leaned closer, listening intently, caught in the subtle nuances of every chord and every pause. Some closed their eyes, absorbed completely. Others exchanged brief glances, sharing silent acknowledgement of the skill and emotion before them. Even those who did not fully understand music seemed affected, as though they had been touched by a truth they could not articulate. She noticed the host watching her again. He no longer appeared skeptical or impatient. Instead, his expression revealed curiosity and surprise, perhaps even admiration. He had underestimated her at first, and now he could not deny what he was witnessing. The quiet authority she projected through her music was undeniable, commanding attention without force or arrogance. As the final notes of her composition echoed through the room, there was a moment of suspended silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The sound lingered in the air, wrapping around the guests and filling the space with a sense of awe. She allowed herself to pause, feeling the weight of the moment and the significance of what had just occurred. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was tentative at first, polite and careful, but it quickly grew louder, more enthusiastic, and more genuine. People stood without thinking, clapping not just for the music, but for the honesty, skill, and courage it represented. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a forced, awkward moment had become an experience that everyone would remember. She rose from the bench, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. She did not smile broadly, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her posture and expression. This was more than recognition. This was validation of years of perseverance, of quiet dedication, and of unwavering commitment to her craft. Guests began to approach her once more, some with admiration, others with genuine curiosity. They asked where she had studied, who had inspired her, and how she had developed such talent. She answered modestly, careful to remain grounded even as the room's attention focused on her. Each question reminded her of the journey that had brought her to this moment, a journey filled with obstacles, doubts. In moments of isolation, she realized that the true impact of the evening went beyond applause or compliments. It was about connection. Her music had allowed people to experience a part of her that she had never been able to express openly. It had broken barriers of judgment, class, and expectation. In a room filled with wealth and status, her talent had spoken louder than any social rank or assumption. The host approached her again, this time with a softer demeanor. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "You've shown us all something we didn't expect, something rare." She nodded, feeling a quiet sense of resolution. It was not about the host or about recognition from others. It was about the truth she had shared through her music and the realization that her gift could no longer be ignored. As the night went on, She continued to play intermittently, each piece telling a different part of her story. She did not perform for attention or praise, but for expression. The guests, having experienced the depth of her talent, listened with respect and fascination. Even those who had been skeptical initially were now engaged, eager to hear the next melody and to understand the emotions behind it. By the end of the evening, it was clear that something remarkable had happened. What had begun as a forced moment of performance had transformed into a revelation. Her talent, once hidden in quiet practice and private spaces, had been recognized. Not just for technical skill, but for its ability to communicate, to move, and to connect with people on a deeper level. She realized that her journey was far from over. This night had opened doors, shifted perceptions, and confirmed her own understanding of her worth. She had faced doubt, fear, and judgment, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of her place in the world. And as she looked around the room, seeing the reactions of the guests and feeling the lingering presence of her music, she knew that this was only the beginning. Her talent had been revealed, and with it, the possibility of a future where she could no longer be underestimated. The night had gone on longer than she had expected. The music she had played continued to ripple through the room, leaving traces in the conversations, in the gestures, and in the quiet expressions of those who had witnessed her talent. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, as if the act of revealing herself through her music had taken both energy and courage she didn't know she possessed. Even though she had returned to her duties as a server, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Guests were no longer distracted by trivial concerns. They were not talking about the expensive decor, the fancy dresses, or the wealth displayed in the room. Instead, they were talking about the music, about her performance, about the unexpected depth that had emerged from someone they had initially underestimated. She noticed people leaning toward one another, whispering in hushed tones, some smiling as they shared their astonishment. The host, who had first forced her to sit at the piano, now stood a few feet away, watching her carefully. His previous arrogance had faded, replaced by a kind of fascination that she could feel without looking directly at him. He cleared his throat, then stepped closer. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly. "I should not have assumed anything. That was incredible." She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without words. She had learned long ago that recognition did not need to be verbal to be meaningful. It could be seen in the eyes, in the subtle gestures, in the way someone listened or responded. And tonight the room was full of recognition, in ways far deeper than mere words. A few guests approached her directly, offering compliments that were genuine and thoughtful. One woman, holding a glass of wine, said softly, "You play like you're telling a story we need to hear. It's not just music, it's life." She smiled faintly, a warmth spreading through her chest. That was exactly what she had hoped to convey, even if she had never imagined it could reach so many people at once. Her music had always been her voice, but it had mostly been silent to the outside world. Now it had spoken clearly, and the room had listened. Another guest, a man who had appeared critical earlier in the evening, stepped forward. "I've attended countless events, heard countless performers," he said slowly, "and I have never been moved like this. You're not just talented, you're extraordinary." The words were unexpected, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of them. She had spent years doubting herself, worrying that her music would never matter outside of the quiet rooms where she practiced. Yet here it was, mattering deeply to a room full of strangers. She took a small breath, grounding herself. Feeling both humility and quiet pride, the piano stood in the center of the room, polished and waiting. Some guests began requesting another piece, their voices gentle but insistent. They were no longer asking for entertainment. They were asking to hear her story continue, to feel the emotions she had been expressing in ways that words could not capture. She walked back to the piano and seated herself with calm grace. The bench felt familiar, almost like a friend. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, then found their place. She began to play again, choosing a piece that was energetic and full of life. A melody she had composed during times of personal struggle and triumph. The room quieted immediately. Conversation ceased, eyes focused, and the energy shifted once more. The first notes carried a vibrancy that made people lean forward, anticipating what was to come. Her fingers moved effortlessly, as if the piano itself understood her intentions. Each chord, each passage reflected years of dedication, of quiet persistence, moments when she had chosen to continue despite obstacles.